Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 112 of The Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. You are all in for a treat today. Doing some experimental podcasting, if you will, a bit of a cross-promotion, dare I say. Some of you may know of the truly groundbreaking work that Dr. Sarah Lewis and her amazing team at Penal Reform Solutions in the United Kingdom are doing around the world. Indeed, I have featured Sarah and many of her team of Avengers on this podcast previously. Sarah appeared way back on episode 33 of the Criminologist podcast, and subsequently I have had Noel Moran, David Hayes, and Cam Stevens all on the show as well. I encourage you to check out those episodes. Well, Sarah and her team at Penal Reform Solutions have a podcast of their own entitled Growth Uncut. I appeared as a guest of Sarah's on Growth Uncut for episode 18 in January of 2021. And so when I noted that we're going to get a bit experimental today, what I was referring to was that I'm going to share with you, the listeners, the interview that Sarah conducted with me when I appeared on her Growth Uncut podcast. But first, a bit about Sarah in the event that you are unfamiliar with her and her work. Dr. Sarah Lewis is a senior growth consultant whose work focuses on prison, school, and penal reform in England and Wales and internationally, actually. She is the director of Penal Reform Solutions, a unique organization that provides consultancy, training, and programs from the perspective of those with practitioner, academic, and lived experience. She designs and delivers programs as well as providing consultancy to prisons, other correctional services that want to improve and grow. Sarah is also the founder of the Growth Alliance and is passionate about creating a growth movement which promotes humanity, hope, and relationships across the criminal justice sector. Dr. Sarah Lewis is the author of Therapeutic Correctional Relationships, a research-informed practitioner guide to developing relationships and mending relational ruptures. From her research in Norwegian prisons, Sarah has created the principles of growth, which are used to promote personal growth in correctional staff and prisoners. Now, this work focuses on proactive, preventative strategies to promote meaning and well-being, leading to better retention of staff and a more professional service. Having worked in secure and residential environments, Sarah has established the Growth Project, which again is an initiative which has been found to transform correctional cultures by magnifying the voice of staff and service users, taking a research-informed approach and a whole systems approach. Now, on a more personal note, I had the pleasure of meeting Sarah last year in Barcelona, Spain. I was part of Ion Dernescu's team of international trainers taking part in his international training school on core correctional skills. And I was sitting in the hotel lobby with Ion and my wife, enjoying a coffee when we see this Mary Poppins-like figure come flying into the room, almost vibrating to check in. And I looked at my wife looked at me, and almost simultaneously we said to each other, that has to be Sarah. Well, we went out to dinner that night, made a true connection, discovered we were kindred spirits, fellow Avengers, as you would say, Sarah, and we have been collaborating ever since on, again, your vision of a growth movement. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Sarah Lewis as she interviews me as part of her Growth Uncut podcast, and I will see you all on the other side.
Welcome to Growth Uncut, a podcast that interviews different people from around the world to share their views on personal growth. We feel passionately about connecting communities and raising awareness around social justice, humanity and relationships. And today I am really privileged to be joined by Joe Arvidsson. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Sarah. How are you?
I'm really well. It's so great to have you on the show. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I can, and it's great being on the show. Thank you for having me. As you said, my name is Joseph Arvidsson. I'm joining you from the state of Minnesota here in the United States. So to give your UK and beyond listeners some context, Minnesota is the musical home of both Bob Dylan and Prince. I am currently the executive director of the Paragon Group and also the founder and host at the Criminologist Media Group. So I produce and host both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist YouTube channel, where we create organic videos, and then I also collect videos from other like-minded subject matter experts around the world and create playlists. So it's a nice resource, if you will, for students or practitioners who want to learn from some cutting-edge individuals. And again, both those platforms, we really just strive to deliver the latest and greatest content with evidence-based practices, corrections, criminology, and of course, desistance from crime. In addition to that, I've got over 30 years of experience in community corrections, probation, parole. I began my career as a probation officer in the state of Florida. And after decades as a PO, I segued into more of an administrative role where I concentrate on implementing and training evidence-based practices. Finally, I've been an adjunct faculty member at two universities here in Minnesota, Metropolitan State University and Concordia University, for a little over 20 years now. I teach courses on corrections, probation, parole, criminology, criminal justice and the media. And then about 3 years ago, that led to me being invited to serve as an executive board member on Concordia University's Criminal Justice Advisory Board. I really like to think of myself as a maven, if you will, which if you look up the definition of a maven, it's a trusted expert in a particular field who seeks to pass timely and relevant knowledge on to others in the respective field. And so I like to do both of those things on my channel and my podcast. I'll be the first to tell you that I'm not the smartest person in the room when I interview subject matter experts in the field, or when I look at the collection of videos which I have compiled on my channel, both my homegrown stuff and then from others I've met on my journey. Again, I'm not the person with the most letters after their name, but I find value in bringing those voices together. All boats rise, so to speak. Which, of course, is what led our paths to cross, Sarah. So again, thank you for having me on the show.
Oh, it's absolutely brilliant. And I guess a burning question I have there, Joe, is how did it all start? So why did you get into this field from the very beginning? What was it that kind of spurred you into this valuable work?
Well, interesting enough. So I was an undergraduate student studying criminal justice. As many corrections folks will tell you over here, we're not very good at arithmetic and math. So we sort of got into the field. And I say, it's funny you mentioned that. I started out as a political science major until one day somebody asked me, "Oh, political science major, where are you going to law school?" And I said to myself, "Oh, I didn't really plan on going to law school." And this person pointed out to me, "Well, with a political science degree, it's not like you get hired after graduation down at the political science factory. There's really not a lot you do with a poli-sci degree other than go to law school. I mean, unless you want to move to DC or something. So I scrambled because I was committed to graduating in 4 years and not disappointing my parents. So I grabbed the course catalog from the university and started looking for other majors and switched my minor rather to political science. And again, every time I thought I found something that I might like, whether it was business or marketing or whatnot, when you looked at the required courses, there was always the requisite math courses. And I had crazy math phobia back then. Just struggled with algebra in high school, kind of thing. And criminal justice was literally the only major that I could find that I didn't have to take a math class. Plus, of course, I grew up on cops and robbers, if you will, television shows and movies. So I was just drawn to it from that aspect of watching, again, cheesy 70s police dramas here in the States. So I got into that as a major. And then I was actually about to graduate, and I'm dating myself, but this would have been back in the 1980s. So back then, a degree in criminal justice was you were going to get into law enforcement. We really didn't have the proliferation of the correctional courses that we do now, and prepping folks for a career in probation and parole. So I panicked and did what anybody else would do. I just segued right into graduate school, and I ended up getting my degree in administration of criminal justice. And of course, I love the coursework. And when I found out I could make a living at it, it was just a win-win situation. And then again, I started my career with the Florida Department of Corrections, and I moved back eventually to the North Tundra of Minnesota. And that's the infancy of my journey, if you will.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I think, from that wide range of experiences that you've had along the way, what would you say, looking at personal growth, how would you conceptualize that? What does it mean to you?
Well, for me, personal growth means, among other things, being uncomfortable. If you're comfortable, in my opinion, you're not really growing. I mean, that's why we call them growing pains. I'm a tall drink of water, Sarah. And I can remember as a child, telling my parents, waking up saying, hey, my legs hurt. And they just brushed it off as, well, you're going through growing pains. But, this same applies to personal growth. It's about taking risk, or at least trying something different, which is, what led me to launch my podcast and my YouTube channel. I just felt this need to continue to grow and to push myself. And I just really wanted to have another outlet to sort of spread the gospel of evidence-based practice and, of course, desistance theory. And like I said, challenge myself personally. I've been on this major learning curve with these projects, but I've really enjoyed every minute of the journey. And I just always see myself as a lifelong learner. I think stagnation, particularly in the context of criminal justice, and more to the point, those criminal justice practitioners who work with justice-involved individuals, stagnation is really our Achilles heel. I know we talk about Robert Martinson and his Nothing Works proclamation in 1974, sort of ground zero. And then thankfully we had the birth of risk needs responsivity, thanks to the Canadians. And then, we thought, well, we're done. We've split the atom. Because we figured out R&R. And now we're seeing the harsh reality of implementation struggles, and that the devil's really in the details when it comes to implementing the principles of risk, need, and responsivity. And then, of course, I've just got such a passion for desistance theory, which I see sort of as the next, it's the future. And of course, I spent half my time trying to convince people that R&R and desistance they're not Coke, Pepsi, or Burger King, McDonald's. They're not in competition. They're 2 points on a continuum. And if we embrace both points of that continuum, we'll serve our clients better. But again, that's just a corollary for, growth means to me always looking for the next thing and never being comfortable. I don't mean physically comfortable, just comfortable as in, well, we've arrived, like we did with R&R or whatever your chosen vocation or livelihood may be. There's no such thing as a settled science.
Yeah.
And I'm not getting political here, but I've heard folks say, well, trust the science, or the science is settled. Science is never settled. If you're a scientist, shame on you for saying the science is settled. That contradicts the scientific method of always challenging the status quo. This is a science, what we do with justice-involved individuals. So it's never settled. We owe it to them, and not just ourselves, to keep on pushing and keep on pushing and keep on pushing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you say, I think complacency is a really tricky thing, isn't it? And I think sometimes when a culture develops that maybe kind of encourages that complacency, I think that's when we get in our kind of sticky situations, really. But it also links to hope, isn't it? That if we can hope in the future, if we can hope that something is bigger than us and better than us, then ultimately we'll always have that drive and that motivation to seek something out and maybe, live that kind of uncomfortable kind of experience, which I think is quite right. I think I encourage the guys we work with quite a lot to lean into that and just to get the learning from the feeling uncomfortable and what you can learn from it. And I think it's a really helpful way to think about it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the issue of complacency, and I think that's so much more true in the public sector, where we don't really have those traditional outcomes or deliverables to measure success. I mean, yes, I know we can measure recidivism, but the culture of the agencies is it's more of lack of a failure is a success.
Mm.
If someone doesn't get hurt or die in the prison, that's a success. If someone doesn't escape, that's a success. If your probation client doesn't reoffend and get splashed all over the front page of the newspaper, that's a success.
Mm.
That's what we're settling for, is, again, not failing, but not, as you said, instilling hope and growth and just pushing folks along their trajectory. It's just, we're so risk averse. So that maybe gets into, we rely so much on risk assessments, but I think that affects the culture and corrections, is that we get so risk averse. We just don't want a failure, but we've set the bar so low for our clients.
Mm. Yeah. And so there's so much scope for creativity, isn't there? And innovation and collaboration. And I think, again, the system isn't maybe set up for that when we're targeted to do specific, key performance indicators, or we kind of encourage that kind of silo-based learning. I think it just gets to a place where everyone's just trying to meet their own targets and not maybe thinking of how collaboration can really enrich the work that we're doing and strive for that perfection. Be ambitious. I think there's so much opportunity there to be more ambitious than we are. So yes, fantastic. Okay, on to my next question then. So you've already touched on some of these things maybe, but in terms of your values, so what are the kind of things that you really value in life?
I just really value the opportunity to have opportunities. I value the fact that, life is really what you make of it. And I have so many opportunities to do so many different things. And as we've talked about, whether it's the podcast or the YouTube stuff or just the occasional publication, I just love, again, life is for the taking, really. I also really value this notion of metacognition and just, having that self-awareness. I think that's huge. I kind of like to use it as a barometer of where I've been and, where I want to go. I value relationships, that social capital, if you will, to coin a phrase from the desistance literature. I value relationships that I've garnered along the way, particularly with my latest ventures into podcasting. That's something that you can't measure that. It's just been so rewarding for me meeting like-minded folks such as yourself, Sarah, and others that I've interviewed. And this, particularly knowing that it's just so much more enriching knowing that our collective goal is this greater good for those we serve in our communities. Yeah, I just really love making connections with people, learning from them, maybe passing on some nuggets of knowledge and experience along the way, but just, again, that mutual growth and, the relationships are really what can't be taken away.
Yeah, and in terms of those relationships, if you were to, I guess, reflect on them and consider who has been your most inspiring, I'm sure you have so many relationships that maybe have been inspiring along the way, but in terms of maybe a few or a couple that you feel have really stand out for you, who are they and why are they inspirational to you, would you say?
Well, as you said, I've been fortunate enough to have met many inspirational individuals in my life. On my short list, I can think of a graduate professor I had in grad school, Dr. Robert Prout. He was one of my graduate instructors, and he was the first person to really introduce me to the world of criminology. He was a former state trooper who later in life turned to academia, went on to get his PhD, and became our department chair. And one thing I learned from him was this notion of, as I've said, consistently challenging the conventional wisdom. And again, I was firmly entrenched in the risk needs responsivity camp, and all of its glorious effect sizes and meta-analysis as a foundation. And then I was introduced into the world of desistance, and that was just this great new frontier that I thought, oh my gosh, there's so much more to this than simply why folks enter into a life of crime. Why are we looking at why folks don't exit a life of crime? And it struck me. And I was arguably hyper partisan with my risk needs responsivity, approaches, because I saw folks that were just ignoring that and just doing the conventional, trail them, nail them, and jail them. And then I saw the desistance stuff, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, this is a whole different perspective on change. It was just eye opening. I can also say my wife, who's a huge inspiration, and I'm not just trying to score brownie points here, but so I actually met my wife. She was a fellow probation officer working for another agency. I was asked by a colleague to serve on a committee, and I thought, I don't know if I've got so much on my plate, kind of thing. And then I resolved my ambivalence and I joined the committee, and one of my coworkers said, what was that all about? It's like, oh, I decided to serve on this committee for a conference. And I jokingly said to him, if nothing else, I figured it's a way to meet girls. And I ended up meeting my wife serving on this committee. Well, she has since left the public sector to become a very successful entrepreneur. And so there's a slogan in the government sector over here that the security of a civil servant job is sort of a double-edged sword. So we refer to it as the golden handcuffs. It's a good gig, but it's really tough to break free. So the fact that she had the courage to leave a very secure and comfortable position with the government to take a chance on herself and her dreams, I mean, that just really was truly inspirational to me. And, the woman is a true workaholic. So when I find myself, feeling sorry for myself about being overwhelmed and all I've got on my plate, I can just draw an inspiration from her and her 7 days a week, 12-hour work days for inspiration. And then I don't want to hurt my back dropping names, so I won't, but I've had the great fortune of meeting some of the leading thinkers up in Canada, in the correctional world, and then on your side of the pond, as they say, I've gotten the good fortune to get to know some of the leading thinkers in desistance. And those folks, again, are truly inspirational to me because they've shown me that what could be perceived as this sort of dry, esoteric vocation that some may see as static is really this dynamic thing. And as you've articulated, there's so many opportunities to do fun and exciting things. And again, those folks I met are sort of the rock stars of academia, and they've really inspired me to again bring my lust for life into this vocation and make the most of it.
Yeah, they are. I love the fact you call them rock stars. They are so rock stars. I think they are I always remember writing after whether it was Shad Maruna or Fergus McNeil, I guess in terms of my rock stars, but just at the end always write, P.S. you're my hero. They are. And I know that made me seem a bit, a bit silly really, but I kind of think, you got to know it because there must be so many people out there that think that that believe the same and that just look at these, these inspirational kind of academics that are talking in real terms about what it looks like and what it feels like to implement desistance and some of those kind of key challenges. And, even earlier we were talking before we kind of went online was about how humbling just speaking to them is, and how humble they are in terms of kind of their achievements. And I think there's something just really that inspires me even more. I think, they're just that kind of quiet and considered and assured kind of individuals that I kind of keep a lot of lights, bright, I guess, when things get dark and things get tricky. So I'm absolutely with you in terms of rock stars. I love that. I think that's brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on, I guess we talked about some of the highlights really in terms of those relationships. Moving on to some of the trickier parts of your life. So what would be your biggest challenge, and what have you learned from it, Joe?
I would say my biggest challenge was just letting go of my previous constructs that I had created for myself. I started my career in corrections working with the Florida Department of Corrections, and this was in 1988, working in South Florida. So the culture there was very law enforcement oriented. Again, we were seeing the crack cocaine epidemic at the time in South Florida. And so that was my early template of my career, was, again, this sort of containment model. And the challenge for me was resolving that ambivalence when that approach was challenged by the research, particularly when I became an adjunct and was having more of the science sort of thrown in my face, realizing that my early approach wasn't the best approach. I know that I've been teaching now for, I guess, over 20 years. And when I look back at some of my early syllabi and look at those probation and parole classes that I taught, they were very how-to, right? They were very, when you become a PO, this is how you write a pre-sentence investigation. This is how you request issuance of a warrant from the court. This is how, it's very like a manual. Now, when I look at my courses, my probation and parole courses, they're very much coming from a criminology approach. They're not how-to at all. It's criminal. I tell my students on day one, you're going to think at times you're in a criminology course. So I'm throwing everything at them, from Al Bandura social learning theory to, of course, Bonta and Andrews and their risk needs responsivity model, and now the emerging desistance theories, Fergus McNeil, Shad Maruna, Beth Weaver. And now I'm looking at even how desistance sort of dovetails with substance use recovery approaches, thanks to David Best and company. So again, it's not the how-to, it's again, more of the criminal thinking. But again, for me, the challenge was vocationally making that shift as well. And just really, I endeavor to balance my passion with getting too siloed. Because I become such an advocate for whatever I'm discovering. At times it's tough to let go of that and say, okay, now go, but you've got to discover something else. Like I said, like I was with being so passionate and almost, like I said, partisan about risk needs responsivity when I would look at what didn't work. And I've had to say to myself, you've got to balance that now with desistance theory. And of course, also realize, hey, guess what? In 10, 20 years, if people look at desistance like we look at R&R now, you've got to be in a position to move on from that as well. Yeah. Right. Because like I said, the science is never settled. So again, my challenge, I guess, would be not letting my zeal become a double-edged sword and keeping me, such a zealot that I refuse to see other perspectives. Yeah.
It's a bit like Lord of the Rings, isn't it? When you have like the ring, and it's like, that's our precious stuff. Don't get rid of it. And someone's like, throw it in the lake or throw it in the river or wherever they threw it. But I think there's something there about letting go of stuff and how uncomfortable it is sometimes to. I remember reading, I was at the university and my supervisor for my PhD, he gave me an article called I think it was, I don't know if it was an article, I think it was more a summary of a speech by Pat Carlin about against rehabilitation. And I said to him, I don't want to read it. I was well knee deep in cognitive behavioural work and believed it was the silver bullet and the answer to everything. And he said, you need to read this. And I just was like, I can't do it. I'm not reading it. And I think I sat on it for like 3 months because it was precious. It was like, this is what I've done. This is what was worthy. And now you're going to tell me that there's problems with it, which of course there are. So yeah, I absolutely get that. I think it goes back to feeling uncomfortable, doesn't it? In some senses, just moving out of that place of comfort and that includes theory and the application of it, I guess. So,
and that's and what I learned from that all was, again, sort of this realization that there's a parallel process going on between our clients and the practitioners. Both of those populations are on their respective trajectories, and both are better served by realizing that, which is really a challenge in and of itself. It's not so much about, it is as much about getting the clients to address their risk variables and address their sort of condemnation script, but it's getting the POs to, again, on that parallel process, to move from, like I said, containment, surveillance to change agent, and getting away from risk aversion and just really diving into embracing risk, for the betterment. If probation officers can become experts in the change process by learning from their own personal changes, then they can leverage that knowledge and experience to their caseloads. But by viewing justice-involved individuals as sort of a lesser or as different and keeping them at arm's length, I think of how often I hear people use that term, or my colleagues rather use that term, those people. Those type of statements that you hear on the water cooler, that is just, it's so counterproductive. And I could use the analogy in education, with teachers and students. The best teachers today were inspired by great teachers that they learned from, and they learned how education works. Well, for folks in corrections, probation, parole, even social work, the best in those fields, I would contend, they drew from their own growth experiences to become experts in the human change process. And that human change, it has consistent themes, whether it's addiction or deviant behavior or criminality or weight loss or going back to school. It's all about, that human change process. And the best practitioners realize this. And like I said, they leverage their experiences when working with their clients. Now, the problem is many practitioners won't go there because they refuse to acknowledge those commonalities between themselves and their clients. And it's just easier to keep that wall up and to separate themselves from their clients. They don't want to get into that uncomfortable space, that uncomfortable place where real growth happens. And again, that challenge is just continuing to realize that for me, my current constructs and beliefs, well, they're not final either. That's the challenge. For all justice individuals is to get them to desist from crime. They've got to go to their previous constructs, their attitudes and beliefs, which have, sort of anchored their antisocial thoughts and feelings, and the need to grow from positive relationships in their lives, to augment their social capital and to build their human capital through education and employment. Again, it's such a parallel process that I think practitioners could really learn from, again, just reflecting on themselves and the growth and their own trajectories and seeing how they advanced and apply those concepts. So,
yeah, I think that's a lovely way to put it. And I think in some senses, one of the first things we do within any kind of growth work that we do is around reflective practice and just providing space where practitioners can learn about themselves. Because I think that can be lacking, that like you talk about the kind of how-tos and trying to get the job done, that kind of consumes people sometimes. Whereas, if we can talk about reflection on action and reflection in action and some of those really useful reflective models that can get people to really understand what it is that drives them and what it is that they value and how their values influence the way in which they behave with other people. I think all of that stuff is we own that. It's our responsibility. And I think when we're building therapeutic correctional relationships, that's something that we need to have that as part of our awareness, that we have these things that we carry, and we have these preconceptions that are going to influence the way in which we work with people, and that's normal, but we have to think about how we manage that and how we express that. So there's so much work to be done there, I think. But yes. So finally, moving on to our last question. If you were to improve one thing to grow our communities, and I guess for us, maybe the global community here, to make them safer and happier places, what would you do? What one thing would you do?
I would endeavor to convince people that we need to stop being so binary, and I've used this term hyperpartisan, and trying to learn and how to grow. again, stop being so binary in our approaches, to the growth process. There's a great opportunity right now, I think, because of all the civil unrest going on, particularly here in the United States, to do some serious criminal justice reform. But I think that's being threatened by the extreme stances being taken on both sides. And I don't think the greater good is served by that. So you hear things like, well, we need to abolish prisons and defund the police. It's just simply, those statements are simply too radical, in my opinion, to bring about compromise, which we need to reform. Yes, there is systemic racism in certain parts of the criminal justice system, but I just don't think we can demonize an entire vocation and expect to make progress or to grow, if you will. I just saw something the other day. Barack Obama himself said, defund the police is a catchy slogan, but, and I'm paraphrasing here, you're simply losing too many folks with that approach. And I think when people use outliers to base policy on, that's not good.
No.
The flip side could do the same thing, and they could, they could cite a true career criminal, again, outlier. But that's not the norm, as we both know. Most individuals, preventions at all, will eventually desist out of crime. But we can't cite, like I said, the fringe individual and those that commit these monstrous deeds to try to leverage emotion to make our case. And again, just meet in the middle on this. I won't try to convince someone that everything is, unicorns and rainbows when dealing with justice involved individuals. If you don't try to convince me that every client is Jack the Ripper who needs to be thrown in the Tower of London for life, let's, agree to meet in the middle here. Like I said, I mentioned some of my academic work, and a lot of my students that take my corrections leadership course come from law enforcement backgrounds. And Sarah, when I introduce them to things like criminogenic need and even just cognitive behavioral interventions 101, they're blown away by this. Because again, they're coming from, and it's legitimate, their role is more immediate public safety, not long-term, like you and I do. But when they actually say, oh, you mean there's a reason that, I locked that kid up 6 times over the summer, and it's not just because he's a blankety blank. It's like, no, it's because he's riddled with criminogenic needs. Like, oh yeah, you're right. His folks are divorced and he's got family members in prison and he struggles with addiction and peers. And, when I connect the dots for them, they're blown away by that. That to me is where criminal justice reform comes in, not these blanket statements of, well, let's just defund the police. It's like, no, let's just continue to educate. Because again, the folks I've educated on this, they just say, yeah, this should be required training at the academy. They don't teach us this. It's just such an us them mentality. It's just, and I would say, even within the world of evidence-based practices, I'll share this story because it was shared on my podcast. I don't know if you're familiar with Guy Burgon in Canada. He and his team, they created the STIX practice model, which I know has been trained around the world. Very well respected, another rock star, if you will. Well, he was on my podcast a month or two ago, and he was saying that he was at a conference speaking, and then speaking directly after him was Tony Ward of the Good Lives model.
Yeah.
So he tells me how Tony takes the stage, and then Guy stuck around to hear what he had to say. And the first thing Tony says, he points to Guy and says, everything that guy just said is wrong.
Wow.
And this is basically, R&R versus Good Lives model. So I thought, oh my gosh, even in the ivory tower world of evidence-based practices, we have this hyper-partisanship going on. Really? We can't even agree to disagree at that level. When folks listen to my podcast, my tagline that I end every show with is, there's no them, there's only us. And I think if people start to realize that, as we've talked about, everyone's going to be released from custody. Someone's not defined by by the worst thing that they did on their worst day of their life.
Yeah.
Their past does not define them. And we just have to let that go. And again, realize there's no them. There's us. There's no those guys or these people or those types of offenders or whatnot. So that is what, like I said, if I could make communities safer and happier, that's where it would start, with getting out of this sort of binary approach to how we do business.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's all around raising awareness, isn't it? And I think, that looking at all of the kind of responses across Growth Uncut over the kind of 15, 16 episodes we've done, I think it goes back to that. It goes back with, whether it's more acceptance, whether it's about, raising awareness, whether it's about standing together, whether it's about, just narrowing that gap. It's about, like you say, that them and us is so destructive and it operates at so many different levels. I kind of think whether that's between prisoners and prison officers or whether that's between officers and managers or, there's so many divides. And I kind of think we all want the same thing. We all want a safer place to grow up in or our kids to grow up in. And I kind of think, that's certainly one way in which we can start that process, isn't it? So thank you so much, Joe. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. It's been so nice to not only participate in your podcast, but also for you to come on to Growth Uncut. I feel utterly privileged. So thank you so much for coming.
As do I, Sarah, and thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. Goodbye.
All right, good day.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you'd like to find out a little bit more about us, please check out our website on www.penalreformsolutions.com or check us out on Instagram, LinkedIn, or Twitter or Facebook on Penal Reform Solutions. If you'd also like to contribute to help this podcast run, then please check out our Patreon account on www.patreon.com/growthmovement. Thanks so much and take care.
Thank you, Sarah, for having me on your Growth Uncut podcast. I should note, obviously, this was recorded a while back. They are currently on hiatus, but will return in September of 2022. In the meantime, please go back and check out some previous episodes from Growth Uncut. I can tell you right now, you are going to recognize the all-stars that Sarah has on her program. So please check out Growth Uncut, available on all quality podcast platforms. And I will endeavor to load as many web links as I can related to Sarah's work with Growth Uncut, Penal Reform Solutions, and all the great work her and her team are doing. I've been talking about this for the last couple of weeks. If you wish to become a financial supporter of the Criminologist podcast, there's going to be a link in the episode description of this show entitled Become a Supporter. Just click on that link, Become a Supporter, and you will learn all about how to support the Criminologist podcast. You can become a supporter of the program for as little as $3 per month, or you can save some money by opting to become a yearly supporter. Simply a way for you to show your appreciation for the program and help offset some of our overhead cost. Back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, implementation science, or of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this program, feel free to contact the show via our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow on Twitter. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, or Dr. Sarah Lewis on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, please check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is available. Simply reach out for details. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you are part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the show. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
It's a bit like Lord of the Rings, isn't it? You know, when you have like the ring, and it's like, that's our precious stuff. Don't get rid of it. And someone's like, throw it in the lake or throw it in the river or wherever they threw it.
Cast it into the fire. Destroy it. No.
The Criminologist podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.